Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers, welcome to this episode of the podcast. So we interview Curtis Millsap from Millsap Farms. He's located around 4 miles outside of Springfield, Missouri. So not some place that you would, say there's amazing farms in Missouri, but there's some fabulous farmers out there. And Curtis names a bunch of them in the episode and then talks about his background, his history of farming. So I actually have met Curtis a number of years ago at a conference. Then a couple years later, we visited his farm with Paul and Sandy Arnold when we were out there presenting for a conference, but really didn't get to know Curtis well until this summer at the Frozen Ground Conference. And actually it was on the way to the Frozen Ground Conference. So he messaged me about a week ahead of the conference, says, Michael, are you going? And I was like, yeah, I'm going. And he's like, how are you getting there? I said, well, I was going to take a flight. And he says, well, we're going to be going by pretty close to you. Would you want to just ride with us? Because they were driving out to pick up a piece of farm equipment. And so I was like, sure. Well, then he told me what time he was swinging by. So he was swinging by at 3 a.m. because they were driving straight through between the two of them. And so I ended up meeting them at our local airport because I was going to fly back. And so at 3 a.m. they picked me up and we drove pretty much all day and got there around, I think like 4 or 5 p.m. It was a long drive. I spent the first couple hours sleeping in the back seat on a peach box full of delicious peaches that he had brought. And then we, the next 4, 5, 6 hours was spent just talking, the deep talking about, farming, about the struggles, about the successes, about the interpersonality of working with team, about building a farm in a challenging environment. And Missouri is a challenging environment. So really appreciate Curtis and what he's done out there in his farm, the heart he has toward the farming community of just sharing his farm with people and just sharing his knowledge. And I really appreciate the deep thinker that he is that he has spent a long time thinking about this and working on building a farm. And it's just not a farm that's just been thrown together. He's put a lot of thought into it with the pizza night, being able to add that pizza night, thinking strategically about what size their farm should be. So in this episode, we talk about a couple large, I think I like to summarize in a couple, like 3 buckets that we dive into. Obviously, we talk about his background, how he got into farming, his journey into farming, but it really comes down to community. So he's cultivated community intensively there. He has a huge heart. They've adopted 5 children. And so they have 5 biological children of their own. So an extension of that, several of their employees and interns live on the farm as well as his father-in-law. So, having a lot of people on the farm, they have a lot of visitors. They also have weekly pizza night, which brings over 250 people onto their farm once a week. So there's a lot of aspects of community that he has intentionally built around his farm. The second thing is CSA. So they have about 170 members CSA. They've had the CSA for a very long time. So they have, every year they've worked on making it different, improving it. Recently, they've added software that helps them do that as well. And they've been quite pleased with that and that the oversight that software has given them. And then the third thing that Curtis has done here is team. They have built a solid team. So he has a farm manager who he co-farms with, as well as a team of interns and apprentices and other hourly people that work on their farm. And with that farm team, they all eat breakfast together in the morning. And I think that's incredibly interesting that they have, that you like your employees and you work with your employees so closely that you do share a meal together. This is a great episode. There's a lot to unpack here. It's a long episode, and I felt actually at the end of this, there were so many questions I wanted to have asked, but I just didn't want the episode to go over 2 hours. And I actually had a training I had to do at the end of that time anyway, so I had to kind of get off to keep moving on with my day. But have a listen. You're going to enjoy this. There's so many deep nuggets that Curtis shares, and I know you're going to enjoy the episode. Welcome to the podcast, Curtis.
Thanks for having me, Michael, and thanks for doing the work you're doing. I think, the more we talk to each other and the more we share information, the better we all get.
Absolutely. So, Curtis, can you give us a little bit of an overview of your farming operation?
Sure. Yeah. We're Millsap Farm. We're located 4 miles outside of Springfield, Missouri, which is a metro area of about 400,000 people. It's also my hometown, born and raised here. spent some time away, but we ended up coming back here. Initially moved back to Springfield in 2003 after having lived in California and New Mexico, and then bought a 12-acre farm in 2007. That's where we are now. Sorry, I said 20-acre farm. We've been here 12 years. And on that 20 acres, we grow about maybe 2.5 acres of vegetables. That is our full-time income. We also do a thing called Pizza Night. So it's a little agritourism venture. And that's turned out to be a pretty big deal for us. We have about 250 people come out to the farm and join us for pizza every Thursday night. So that's become a big deal, part of what we do. We've done, since the very beginning of our farm, we've done community-supported agriculture. It was a CSA has always been a feature of our farm, and it's grown over time. It started, I think, at about 25 members back in 2007, 2008. And then we're now at about 170 summer members and about 50 to 70 winter members. And we're changing that up a little bit, and we can get into that a little bit later. But we're kind of shifting how we do winter particularly. But that's been a stable feature of our farm. We also sell at a farmer's market here in Springfield. That's a pretty good market. Springfield has some kind of interesting quirks in terms of marketing, and I think specifically would say that I think prices are a little bit suppressed from what you see in other places in the country sometimes, at least for certain products. But there's advantages and disadvantages to that as far as cost of living and things like that too. So we can dig in a little more when we talk about marketing. But Springfield's home for us, and that's how we ended up here, family connections and so on. My wife is from Denver area originally, but we've settled here and pretty happy to be here.
Very cool. So, Curtis, how did you get started farming? What was your background before that?
I have done a bunch of different things. I started, I think my first professional job was painting houses, done a lot of different maintenance and construction type work over the years. I was a sign maker in California, Santa Barbara, California. I was a tour guide for fifth graders to the state capitol in California for a couple of seasons. I've been a whitewater river guide out in Colorado. I've been probably one of the most relevant jobs I've had was I was a middle school science and social studies teacher for a couple of years in New Mexico as a charter school teacher. And then we moved back to Springfield in 2003, having gone to California and Colorado and New Mexico for a few years. And when we came back here, I kind of stumbled into a construction job. I mean, I say stumbled as in I wasn't intending to end up in construction. It was the work that I found. Mm-hmm. And it paid well. It took care of my family. I had a young family at the time. We had adopted at that point our son, Zach. I should mention that we have 10 kids, and we have 5 adopted, 5 biological. And so at that point, we had adopted Zach in New Mexico as a teenager and had moved back to Springfield in part so we could be close to family and have a good environment for him to grow up in. And then we started our biological family as well when we moved back here. And so I was doing this construction gig because it paid the bills and kept the roof over our heads and kept food on our table. But I really did not enjoy the work. I was, and frankly, not a great contractor. I was kind of one of the bad contractors who was like, show up and do some work and then have to leave for a week and then come back and work on it a little more. And we can get into why that was when we get into time management and stuff. But that was just the reality for us. So I learned a lot about myself in that process, but the main thing I learned was I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. I'm leaving the house at 6 a.m. and I would come home 5 or 6 p.m. Mm-hmm. And I was missing out on my family. I really didn't, this young family, and I wanted to be there, part of it. And at the same time, I was spending a lot of time on my knees in the morning, praying and saying, what am I doing here? This isn't what I set out to do. When I don't know exactly what it is I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm frustrated by this, and I don't find this work fulfilling at all. And so I kept getting this sort of clear message: you need to farm. And I'd say, but really, because I got to support a family, like, what am I really going to do? And I had read Joel Salatin, and I had read some Elliot Coleman, and one of Salatin's things, and it's pretty famous for saying, you can pay a mortgage or you can pay an income, but don't expect to pay both with a farm. And so I had that in my head, and that was, frankly, kind of a stumbling block for a while for me, because I kept saying, well, and I kind of making bargains, the things we do, we kind of make promises to ourselves and to others and say, well, this is the bargain, And so for me, the bargain for a while was I'll save up enough money or I'll pay off the farm initially. It was, and so I'll pay off the farm. That way we won't have to, because, we only owed about $60,000 on our first piece of land. And so we said, well, that we ought to be able to do that in a year or two. Well, the first year we made almost zero progress on that. And so I said, well, that's not really working. So in the second year, I said, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll save up enough money to live off of for a year. And then we can just, then when we can kind of live on that cushion, it's a way to get started. And of course, that also didn't really come to pass because of the Peter principle, which is basically, you spend whatever you make. And then of course, also we were a growing family, so we had increasing expenses. And by that time, I had a couple of daughters, newborn daughter. I had two daughters, 17 months apart. So 14 months apart. Sorry. So they're close. And so we had a kind of a quick growth in our family. So by year 3, I was kind of going, I don't know, this isn't working. I'm not making any progress toward this farming thing. And that year and the subsequent year combined, we lost about $30,000 in construction. And it's a long story about how that happened. But essentially, I ended up finishing jobs. Frankly, I feel like finishing them with honor and integrity, but ending up holding the bag on about $30,000 of debt. And that was a real wake-up call. That was me going, wow, here I am doing the thing I don't want to do because I thought it was going to be the thing that would at least just earn my income. And I'm realizing that it's not doing either one. I don't want to do it, and it's not actually paying the bills. And it was just this okay, it was time for surrender. It was time to go, well, I believe that I'm supposed to be a farmer. I feel like that's my calling. And I've been denying that now for almost 4 years. And it's time to get real and do what I think I'm supposed to do. So I ended up that summer, my wife and I, we take a vacation every year. But one of the things that we've always done is go out to Colorado for a week of camp out in the mountains. And after camp that year, it's family camp kind of a deal. After family camp, my mother-in-law took the kids and went for a day and kept them out of our hair. And we spent the day figuring out what we were going to do, creating a business plan. And I mean, looking back at that business plan, it's almost a joke because you look at it and you go, oh my goodness, we were so naive. We thought, we could do this, this, and this, and it would all just pan out. But we did at least have a plan, and so we jotted down how many chickens we were going to do some pastured poultry. So how many chickens are we going to need to raise to make this much money? And how many CSA members will we need to have? And about how much vegetable space. I had read by that time Sharing the Harvest by Elizabeth Henderson, which is a great book on CSA. And so kind of had some good numbers and ideas about how that was all going to work. But, truly it was just a sketch. But that was August of 2007. And then in February of 2008, we took the big leap. I had a couple projects I still had to finish up, but we took a big leap then and jumped into farming full time and have not looked back. Have basically since then to do what we do full time. There certainly have been times when I've done jobs that oftentimes construction jobs that just paid big amounts of cash that I knew I could go in for a week or two and sock a bunch of money away. But that's, and that was my first, I think about 4 years. I did a little bit of that still on the side. But February of 2008, I really just started identifying as a farmer and realizing that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to make sure that I do that full time. And if I have to do other things to earn a little cash, that's okay. But I am a farmer and that's what I'm going to be. That's how I'm going to earn most of my income. And it's just snowballed from there. So it's been a really good run.
Very cool. So it is very helpful to have those transferable skills from the construction, obviously for building out parts of your farm and that sort of thing. And then also being able to take those short-term jobs to bring in that cash.
Absolutely. And for me, people often ask what sort of skills do you think farmers need to have? And there's two solid answers to that. And one is business, which I definitely did not have, which is part of why I ended up $30,000 in debt with construction. So that's been an ongoing challenge for me. Business savvy has never been a strong point. But the other side of it is, particularly in the scale growing that I'm doing and the style growing I'm doing, construction's been big. I have 25,000 square feet of tunnels and greenhouses. It's about a quarter of my production is covered space. And we've built all of those ourselves other than the one that was here when we got here. So that is to say, that I think for me, having a background in construction and maintenance has been really big. Of course, I see other farms that don't, and so I don't think that's critical. But I think in my situation, that's one of my special advantages.
Absolutely, very cool. So, what does a typical day look like for you on the farm?
I start my mornings early. I'm definitely a morning person. I'm pretty much always out of bed by 5. I try to avoid working at that point. I usually take an hour and have some quiet time, have a cup of tea, sit in we built an addition on the house a couple of years back where I can watch the sunrise. And I really enjoy sitting up there and watching that unfold, watching the dark turn to light. And then usually around 6 or so, I'll turn my attention to planning for the day. Well, I used to use sort of a get things done system, getting things done, and now and I sort of do a similar system now. But basically, I'm looking at my list of all the things that need to get done and prioritizing, figuring out who's going to do these, making assignments. And then I'll sometimes end up digging into office work as well at that point, depending on the day and, what we need to get done. A lot of times this time of year, now it's getting a little better now, but in the summertime, it's so hot. And of course, being in Southwest Missouri, it does get quite hot and humid here. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes by 6:30 or 7, we need to be out in the field getting our stuff done because it's not going to get any better. It's the best. The best 2 hours of the day around here in the summer are from 6 to 8 because after that it can get pretty oppressive outside. So I start out that way with some quiet time and some planning, and then at 8 o'clock we gather, the crew and my family gathers for morning meeting and breakfast. And we take turns cooking breakfast. My daughters are a big part of that, and so they do a lot of the cooking, and then I cook a breakfast every now and then, and my farm manager as well. So we take turns, but we sit down for breakfast together. We have an opportunity. I think it's really important. We're not just planning, but we're also just connecting. And so, part of our time in that meeting is definitely spent with exactly what are we going to do today, what are we going to do in this week, anything we need to touch on for the month, and even beyond that. It's our opportunity to do that level of planning, but it's also our opportunity just to say, how was your weekend? And did you hear that big bang in the night or what? There's always something to talk about, right? And just connecting, it's worth the time, I think. Then about 9 o'clock, 8:45 to 9, we're out the door into the field, divided up into crews, getting things done. And that's a big deal. Figuring out what everybody's doing and figuring out how to scaffold that. So 9 o'clock, we're out, we're on our way, getting things done. And then our days from there are dependent on the day of the week. So Monday is sort of a catch-all farm day. We do a lot of weed control on Mondays, transplanting, seeding, and weeding, that sort of business, field work. Tuesdays are our CSA days. So that's a big harvest day, big distribution day. And of course, that's got lots to get done. And that's most of what happens on Tuesdays. We often have CSA helpers that come out on Tuesdays. Not every Tuesday, but most Tuesdays we have a couple of folks come out from the CSA that help us. So that's kind of a fun community day as well. CSA pickup is from 4 to 6 in the evenings. And we have about 130 of our members that either pick up or have deliveries on Tuesday. So that's a big day. Wednesday, we have what we kind of think of it as our community day. We have a lot of people who come out and volunteer and spend time with us. And we mostly direct them to be here on Wednesdays. And so it gets, again, kind of a catch-all farm day. We end up doing a lot of construction on Wednesdays, maintenance and that sort of work. We also do some harvest, depending on what our week looks like. We've got some restaurant orders that often go out on Wednesdays. And then Thursday is pizza night. Thursday is the day, and this was a big deal a few years back when we changed this. We said Thursdays, we are not going to allow guests on the farm, essentially. So if you live here on the farm, great. We're all here. We're all doing what we do, working at different tasks. But we don't encourage people to come out and visit us on Thursdays. And that's been really good. It's been good to have one day a week when it's really just us and we're focused on things that it's hard to do if other people are interfering all the time. So interfering is the wrong word. Interrupting, that's what I mean to say.
Yeah.
Thursday evening then. So, we start Thursday with this sort of withdrawn, we're doing our thing, sort of cloistered on the farm. And then Thursday evening at about 5:15, 5:30, the masses descend on us. We have about 250 people show up for pizza night. And so that reverses the paradigm, and suddenly we're surrounded by lots and lots of community members. But that's great because it's what it is, a day of preparation and sort of a little bit of isolation, followed by a really fun big party that evening. And I should mention too, Thursdays, of course, the pizza prep itself is a big part of the work. And my wife shoulders the vast majority of that. She's an amazing chef. She has a very creative mind. And so she works on all these different combinations. And then her and my daughters and other, sometimes other people will help prep that Thursday morning. So it's a big part of Thursday as well. Friday's farmers market harvest, same, probably similar on a lot of farms, but we spend most of the day Friday harvesting. And then we also take some CSA shares to market. So there's some harvest and then packing of those shares. And then Saturday, 2 or 3 of us will go to market. And so that varies seasonally as to how many people we need and so on. But we always have somebody at market. And then one Saturday a month, I run a CSA crew work day. And that'll be usually, 12 to 15 CSA members will come out and work with us on the farm. And if we don't have people working with us on the farm, then Saturdays in the summer tend to be sort of my catch up, get things done. Again, that sort of non-distracted work where I can just not supervise anybody and get things done on my own. In the wintertime, it's a little more relaxed, and it's usually I'm able to just hang out with family in the winter. on Saturdays. And Sundays are a family day. We don't do any work other than just turning water on and off, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Very cool. You have a very set schedule, which I think is so important for farms.
Yeah, I often say it's important to have a plan because then you know when you've deviated from it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, the point of that is that sometimes you got to change the plan. I mean, so for example, this week I had an opportunity come up that we're going to go get a bunch of peonies out in Kansas. So Friday for me is going to look very different. Friday and Saturday I'm taking off and going out to Kansas to dig up a bunch of peonies, and I'll be gone for a day and a half doing that. But I know because I have this weekly schedule that that's going to put an extra load on my farm manager and on the rest of the crew. And so we're going to make sure that we do some farmers market harvest today and get some of that work kind of preloaded so that we're not left holding the bag. And I know that because I've got a plan. And so when I deviate from that plan, I know I've got to compensate. So yeah.
Very cool. So let's move into a little bit more about that task management. What systems have you set up to ensure you focus and tackle the most vital priorities?
Getting things done was kind of my jumping off point. And I can't remember the guy's name.
Isn't that David Allen Miller?
You got it. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. And this is a funny story, actually. So I was working construction doing my own thing. I was a contractor at the time. And one of my clients gave me that book. And in hindsight, it was one of those sort of backhanded gifts, So he was like, I think you need this. I was like, you're right, I do. So, but that was a really useful tool for us for a long time. And basically that system was, identifying, always capturing. That's the thing that I think is at the center of any good plan is capturing all the information you need to capture. Because I know, and this is I think this was highlighted in the getting things done stuff. But if we have to hold that stuff in our heads, it just clutters up our head. As soon as I see something that needs to get done, or talk about something with somebody else and go, oh, I need to follow up on that in some way, then I want to make sure and get it written down. And so in the past, that was a little notebook. Nowadays, I use an app called Trello on my smartphone. And Trello's been a real great tool for us that way. But I want to capture everything. And then once that's captured, then I'm able to sort those out into a list of, this is, some things that need to get done. And on Trello, we have lists that say today, this week, next week, this month, and then sort of someday maybe kind of ideas. And we're still developing our system with Trello, but it's been really good for us. And the main key to Trello for us is that we are a very collaborative workspace. So my farm manager and I operate very much like co-farmers, much more so than maybe some crews do. So we really are in a constant conversation. And part of that conversation is in person, but a lot of that conversation happens on Trello, where we are just posting things on our lists, moving them, shuffling them from one category to another, and thinking through, here's all the things that we have observed need to happen on the farm. Here are things coming up that we know will need to happen, and so on. So for example, today, looking at my Trello list, I've got some soil prep that needs to happen for fall crops. I've got some fall crops that need to get irrigated. I've got a few things that need to get transplanted out. Got some farmers market harvest that needs to get done. And then of course there's a bigger list that says, well, and I've also got this door that's not hanging right that needs to get fixed. And I've got, we're rebuilding a sidewall on a greenhouse. And so if I don't take some time and prioritize that, then it's just this avalanche that I cannot handle. And so taking time, this is a good example of that concept, working on my business instead of in my business, is taking a step back and saying, let's make sure that we prioritize, think these things through. Market is important. Anytime that we know this action is going to equal dollars coming in, then that's a pretty high priority. And of course, worker safety and satisfaction is important. So those are going to be high lists as well. Long-term maintenance and building are things that tend to get kicked down the road, and that's okay as long as they don't get kicked so far that they end up costing you money in the long term. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And so we use Trello to do that, and it's been really good. The other wonderful thing about Trello is now all my coworkers, because I have a number of part-time folks and interns and apprentices and things, everybody has a smartphone these days, and being able to pull that list up anywhere you are, look at that, and maybe reminded, maybe it triggers a radio call back to me to say, hey, what did you mean by, reseeding this spinach? So, in any given day, we have all these different lists, and for people to be able to check in with me and look at their list independently is really powerful. So the magic of Trello for us is that everybody has access to that list through their smartphone. And so when somebody looks at that list, and I should mention specifically, everybody on our farm has a list on Trello. And that's part of my morning sort, is I'm going through the things that need to get done this week, things that need to get done today, and putting those onto individuals' lists. And one of the cool things about Trello is I can put it on an individual's list, but I can also tag other people. So I can say, I expect this is your primary responsibility, but I expect these other two people to help you with this. So it fosters a lot of collaboration. And then also it gives them this really easy to access list, which is great because historically I was really bad at losing clipboards. And if you lose your list, you might as well not have done the work, right? I mean, now you've wasted all that time making the list. So that was a tremendously frustrating experience. And I find, at least so far, I have not lost my smartphone. It seems to be a little better attached than clipboards. So that's been good. Trello's been a good tool for us that way. And then the other thing that I'll mention along those lines is it's given us a lot better communication between us and our hourly workers in particular, who, anytime they spend trying to find me, trying to figure out what's going on next, trying to figure out what to do is really horrible use of time. Mm-hmm. So if I can get a good list that's self-explanatory in front of them, and then they've got a radio on their hip, so if it's not totally clear, they can give me a quick radio call and say, what do you mean about this spinach that's out here in the, you wanted me to reseed this, but I'm not sure which bed you want me to do that in. Man, if I can do that over radio and Trello, and they don't wander around for 10 minutes trying to find me, then that's a huge savings right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what do you think the hardest thing you've ever done as a farmer has been?
I thought about this quite a bit. And of course, the initial thing you want to respond is, I think about a lot of natural disasters that have struck. And there have been some notable things. I think one that I think of is the first year we were here. There's a big greenhouse on the property that was here. It's actually built in 1975. So it's a big structural greenhouse, 6,000 square feet, great space. But when we got here, it was pretty much abandoned, had been for about 7 years. So it was pretty grown up and pretty rough, had some broken stuff, and plastic had been left on it, but not cared for, not inflated. So it had weighted itself down and broken in certain places. We spent a lot of time rebuilding, fixing that, getting it all back up to snuff, putting 4 sheets of plastic. It's a 60-footer, so it's a 2 span. So it's 4 sheets of plastic with inflation. So this was a big expense for us back then. It was about $1,200 worth of plastic. And I put it on in November. Super excited, man. Never had a greenhouse before. And now I've got 6,000 square feet, this beautiful space. Start planting all kinds of things in there. And in January, I believe it's January of 2008, we had this really unusual winter thunderstorm, and it dropped baseball-sized hail on us.
Whoa.
And I mean, I've never seen anything like it. It was big enough that I put the hailstones in the freezer, because I was like, nobody's going to believe this. I got to hold on to these and show them. And then sometime later in the summer, somebody put them in their iced tea, They were massive. They were mind-blowing hailstones. And of course, it left holes in all that plastic.
Oh.
And we're just getting started. I feel like this is my calling. I'm feeling really excited and jazzed about all this energy and stuff that we've put into making things happen. And then this just took the wind out of my sails pretty quick. And I didn't know really what to expect. I went up to the greenhouse, which was about 300 feet from our house, knowing that there had to be some damage. And I walk in, and I mean, it wasn't gaping holes, but it was definitely holes punched through that top layer everywhere. And it was a real watershed moment for me, because it was this moment when, in my faith tradition, it's the moment when you choose. You can say, curse God and die. What's wrong with it? What's wrong? What's this all about? I don't understand. I hate this. Or you can just say, well, this is what happens. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, and blessed is the Lord anyway. By grace, that was my reaction. And so from then on, natural disasters have been something we've taken in stride. And so when you ask this question, what's the hardest thing? That's what mind first goes to. But then I think, we've been through a lot of different stuff. I mean, it's the Midwest. We have tornadoes, and hail, and pestilence. Really, the hardest thing is employer-employee relationships. And when I think about my hardest times as a farmer, it almost always comes down to that, because you can't just fix that. Holes in the plastic, you can get up there with tape and you can spend a day and a half taping holes like I did my first year, or you can replace sheets of plastic like I've done subsequent years when we've had hail damage. But it's not so simple when you've got a conflict with an employee, or when you've got somebody living on your farm that you realize is detrimental to the culture of your farm and your family. Those things I find actually in the long term a lot more challenging. So, and I won't be too specific. I've had a number of different things. So it's somewhat general. But the truth is, I'm not a confrontational person. So to me, the status quo, kind of rolling along, everybody's okay. That feels really good. That's what I want to do. But the truth is, there are times when you have those confrontations, or things are just going to continue to be bad. And so for me, those usually involve a lot of mental sort of working up to that, and a lot of stress and anxiety around that. And almost always, I think without exception, once the thing was dealt with, once the hard conversation is had or the beginning of that dialogue, things get better pretty quickly. So one of the things I've learned to do along those lines, still learning to do, but a process that I'm learning, is in trusting myself. I know that I have a desire to be kind and generous and loving, and I know that most of the time that's who I am. And so learning to trust that and be okay with putting myself in those positions where I'm going to have this confrontation, but I know myself well enough that I've got to trust that I'm going to try and be kind and generous through that, and trust that it's going to be okay and it's going to work out. So, but those are the hardest things, I think, for me. And I think that's true for a lot of farmers, really.
Absolutely. I mean, that first year, seeing your hopes and dreams dashed, with that hailstorm, that's got to be, something you have to really step back and be able to look at the big picture. And especially that first year, you may be like, oh my gosh, I can't. So the fact that you survived that and you're still farming is awesome. But I think what you said about the employee aspect is, I think we all say, business was easy until you add people.
Yeah, exactly.
And so because again, that solo aspect is that you can manage everything and you can do everything the best. But then you start adding people who have different personalities, have different skill sets. And now you have to think about how to best utilize them and integrate that into what you're trying to do on a day-to-day basis. So people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So who would you say your mentors were as a farmer? I know you said you read the book from Elizabeth Henderson on CSA, but what other people were you reading or getting information from?
Ed Smith actually was the first gardening book I ever read. I think he's the Gardener's Bible, I believe. And that was a great kicking off point to go, because I grew up gardening, but some of what we did made sense, some of what we did didn't make sense. And reading that book was kind of a fresh look at it and going, okay, well, there's different ways to do this. So that was one. Elliot Coleman, certainly, I've read all his books and just think the world of his writing and his ability to share effectively. He's done a really great job with that. And I would definitely not be an organic vegetable farmer if he hadn't written The New Organic Grower. And then also I would say the Winter Harvest Manual came along in a really timely fashion for us. We were getting into winter production, and so that was a big resource. It continues to be something that we reference pretty regularly. I read a lot by the Weidigers and saw a lot of their presentations, Allison and Paul Weidiger, and they personally got to know them a little bit and have found them to be such wonderful sharing people. The Arnolds as well, Paul and Sandy Arnold are the same way, just amazingly generous with their time and resources. And then more locally, I've had a lot of growers, and one in particular I can think of, a friend, Dan Bigby, who's a conventional vegetable farmer here in town. He's been doing this for, I think Dan's closing in on 40 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he's a serious long-term player in the market and has been growing vegetables, since before we were born, just about. And so I'm in 43, so he's been at it a long time. And so I'll share a great story. I got to know him kind of slowly, and I think that's fair. A lot of times these older growers, more experienced growers, they're willing to share their information, but they also, a lot of times, less experienced growers tend to be, I guess, for lack of a better word, like whippersnappers. We think we know everything, and so sometimes we can be kind of hard to share with, because how many times do you want to share with somebody who doesn't really listen to you?
Yeah.
So Dan and I's relationship kind of warmed up slowly, but he's always been warm and welcoming. And so one day we were talking, and I think he had taken me out to breakfast, and we were sitting there talking, and we were talking about why I was growing organically, because he's always grown conventionally. And he said, I totally understand why you don't want to spray. And he said, and I'm empathetic to that. And he said, I spray as little as possible. And, I don't know anybody who wants to spray, right? He said, I get that. And of course, and I should clarify that we practice organic. We're not certified, but we use organic practices. And so we do spray, but we spray only OMRI allowed materials. And he said, I get that. But he said, here's the thing I don't understand. He said, I don't understand how you grow great big heads of broccoli and cabbage without synthetic nitrogen. And I'll tell you, this was him being very kind and gentle, because I look out at my fields later that day and I go, right, he's right. I'm not growing big heads of cabbage and broccoli. I'm growing very puny heads. When I look at his, Dan was growing these like 3-pound heads of broccoli, and I'm growing these little puny things that takes 3 to fill a bag. And it was those kind of conversations with him where he very gently points out something I might be doing or not doing have been really formative for me. And so, that was it. That one led to me really addressing my fertility and going, well, I need to put a lot more focus on making sure my plants have everything they need to achieve their potential. And he didn't say it by saying, hey, you really need to fertilize more. He just asked a question. And I think that's good mentorship when you're not just out there telling people how to do things, but you're actually addressing, looking at what they're doing and then asking intelligent questions about, have they thought about this and have they considered that? And so, so that's been, Dan, I would hold up as definitely my closest mentor here locally. And he's just been a tremendous resource for me. So, yeah.
Very cool. So if there was a magic reset button as relates to starting your farm, what systems would you go back and put in place sooner rather than later?
Probably the biggest thing that I would do differently if I could go back would be do less tillage from the beginning. We started out pretty tillage intensive, and I didn't have a tractor right off. Well, I had a little tractor right off, but I borrowed tractors, I borrowed plows, I rolled everything, tilled everything up, disked it, and I was just following the typical advice, so it wasn't anything abnormal. But pretty quickly, we figured out that too much tillage was a really bad thing. That you can beat the life right out of your soil pretty quickly, and I think part of that is we're a hot climate in the summer, and so our biological action in our soil is aggressive, and so every time you till, you just burn up a lot of organic matter. So I had a couple of beds early on that I tilled for weed control. And that's a pretty standard thing to do a little, surface tillage for weed control. And it's very satisfying. You go out and till and behind the tiller, you got this chocolate cake looking soil, right? But the truth is, after time, I realized that every time I did that, as soon as it would rain, that soil structure would just collapse. And I'd be back to having a pancake out there, and then it'd be crusted. And then of course, if you haven't spent time observing and measuring and kind of adjusting, then your answer to a pancake is, well, I'll plow it up or, till it again, be fluffed.
Yeah.
But this is not the answer. Fluffing does not solve soil problems. So over the years, we've gone from doing a lot of tillage, most beds getting tilled 2 or 3 times a year, to most beds not getting tilled in a year. We still have we're still using a rototiller. We haven't left it completely behind. But there are beds, in fact, there are plots, areas of my farm where I haven't tilled now for 3, almost 4 years. And the soil just keeps getting better in those places. So we're moving most of the farm, perhaps eventually all the farm, toward a minimum till system. And that means somewhat using handwork. I mean, broad forks and rakes and stirrup hose and things like that to do the initial bed prep, and moving away from tractor implements. And then we do using them very judiciously, thinking about our soil moisture, thinking about our end goals here. What are we headed toward? Are we just using this as kind of a palliative? Are we actually using it for a long-term goal? So a good example of that would be this week, actually, I have on my list, I'm going to go out and S-tine part of a plot, which I like an S-tine because it doesn't invert that much, but it does give me that lifting and that sort of disturbance that I need to be able to shape beds. And so then I'm going to run through with a bed shaper on the back of the tractor. I'm going to shape raised beds. And if things go as I would hope they will, then that'll be the last time I will do tillage in that bed for probably 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
And and when I say tillage, I should be clear. I'll probably run through it with a tilther, so I'll probably till the top inch or two, but I will not be getting into deep tillage again for quite a while. We will broad fork occasionally, especially if we're doing deep-rooted, long-lived crops like tomatoes and peppers, things like that. We'll usually broad fork before those, but really wise thing I heard, actually this was on the Farmer to Farmer podcast years ago, J.M. Fortier, he says, if broad forking is difficult, you're not broad forking enough. And so that's become our motto around here is, hey, if you're finding it hard to broad fork a bed, it's because we're not doing it enough. And so as a result of that, we've just had much better soil. So that's it. If I can go back and reset, I would say right from the beginning, let's be really strategic about when we till and why, when we disturb soil and why, and let's try and keep the life in our soil. There are lots of places on my farm now where I have a lot less earthworms than I had the day I started. And I'm working on reversing that trend.
So the other big part of your farm is your CSA. Tell us a little bit about that. How does that work? What do you focus on?
Yeah, our CSA is about 170 members in the summer and about 50 to 70 in the winter. And we've undergone some pretty big changes over the years. We started out with the chaos model of CSA with our first year.
Yeah,
I think everybody who's done CSA has probably started there, and there's a lot to learn. CSA actually it's a wonderful business model. It's also fairly complex and it has a lot of moving pieces. And so I say, the first couple of years, my CSA were characterized by the dread of the empty box. Every year, every week, I would have this like anxiety that would start. It would basically start, right after we distributed our boxes. That anxiety would start to sort of knot up my stomach. What are we going to put in the box next week? What are we going to put in 4 days from now? What are we going to put in the box tomorrow? And that really reflected poor planning on our part, but also just it reflects the realities of being a new grower where you really don't understand enough to be confident and competent. So that was a real learning point for us. And to talk about farming mentors, Fair Share Farms, Tom and Rebecca at Fair Share Farms in Kearney, Missouri, are wonderful farmers and were very generous. Those early years of our farm, they were teaching a CSA school at a conference, the Great Plains Growers Conference. It's a great conference up in St. Joe, Missouri, every year. And they, in fact, I think that's where we met, wasn't it? I think we met at St. Joe the first time, probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so they taught a CSA school for a number of years in a row. And I've told them this a couple times, but that CSA school took us from what would have become certainly a failed CSA to a really long-term successful CSA. And most of it just came down to understanding the process of planning properly for our CSA. And so that really was, for us, that involved looking at every share through the season and saying, what are we going to distribute this week? And doing that work in January, or even actually December, and saying, now we know what we need, quantities we need, and now we can work backwards from that and say, well, then if we're going to have green beans on the 15th of July, we need to get them in the ground on this date, and this is how much. Initially, that's a tremendous amount of work, but that is how you kill the dread of the empty box, is by doing that work, and knowing I've got a plan. And not just a plan, but, a plan with a little slack built into it, a plan with some realistic expectations. And that, frankly, would have been hard to do. We did some of that work our first year, but it was really hard to even know what to expect our first year. But the second year, we went to that CSA school between our first and second year of CSA. And Tom was very generous in sharing this amazing spreadsheet that he had built over the years to plan. He's a civil engineer by trade, so he is a spreadsheet guru. And so he just had this great resource that he shared with us. And also saw, I think, Henry, the guy from Henry's Farm up in Illinois. I can't think of his last name right now, but he was there talking about his CSA as well. And both of them, that was what it all came down to, was like, start with the end in mind, right? And so that really changed our perspective about CSA, because I think before that we would have said, okay, this thing's a lot of stress. I'm not sure this is really a good model for us. Financially, of course, CSA is wonderful because you get this pre-purchased shares. You have this real financial stability from the very beginning of the season, but that comes with a certain load and a certain fear factor if you're not really ready to make sure that you're going to have those shares every week. So that was a big change. It also came with just some real simple structural changes where we created some paperwork that helped us on a week-to-week basis plan our harvest. And then after we'd done that for a number of years, we started doing a lot of our CSA membership management through Small Farm Central, which was member assembler initially. And that was a huge load off. I am not a spreadsheet guru. I'm the opposite, whatever that is, a spreadsheet klutz or something. And so I just hated trying to track all that membership and payments and all that through CSA was really hard. Through a spreadsheet was really hard for me. And so when Small Farm Central came along with this kind of one-stop management and sales platform, that was huge for me. So Simon Huntley, all credit is due to him for seeing that need and filling it. And then a few years, I guess it's been 2 years now, 2.5 years ago, we were introduced to the Harvey platform, which came from Small Farm Central and Simon, and addressed one of the basic issues that we've always had with CSA, which is choice. And so, the biggest complaints we get from CSA members are always about convenience and choice. The main reasons people don't join CSA is they feel like they won't have enough control over what they get in their box. And that's a legitimate concern. I mean, if you don't like eggplant and you join a CSA, you got a problem, because, you're going to get eggplant, you're going to get beets, you're going to get radishes even. I mean, there's a lot of vegetables that some people just would rather not have. And then there's also people who live for the day they get the beets in their box, and they love to have radishes and eggplant and whatever, and I'm very sympathetic to that, because I have favorite vegetables and least favorites. And so I want to have a diversity, but I also want to be able to plan a little bit. And so Harvey solves that for us. It lets people have their preference. So just to give you Harvey in a nutshell, the way that works is people, when they join, they go through and set their preferences for every vegetable that we will grow in a season. They can go through and they can rate everything from 1 to 4, 1 being, please don't ever put this in my box, and 4 being, every time you've got this, I want it in my box. Maybe, I can't remember if it's 1 to 4, 1 to 5, but whatever. So there's some nuance built in there, but those are kind of the extremes. And then when we build a harvest estimate on Fridays, we go through the fields on Thursday. We walk through the fields. This is approximately what we'll have of this and that and the other. And it looks like we're going to have 150 pounds of tomatoes. Looks like we got 25 bundles of parsley and so on. We plug that into the Harvey platform, and then when we send emails on Friday, it immediately sorts all that produce into people's shares based on their preferences.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty slick deal, and we can actually look at those before we send the emails. We can do a dry run. We can look through the labels, or look through the shares, and make sure that people aren't getting weird things like 6 bundles of herbs or whatever because of some weirdness we've done, or that Harvey's done something strange. But it usually anymore. I mean, our first year there were always some glitches, but it's worked really well. And this year it's just improved dramatically. And so that's the first step. That stuff is going out in these emails. But then the other really cool part is then they've got from Friday when we send the email out to Monday morning when we close the opportunity to trade. And so they can go in there, and if we've offered 150 pounds of tomatoes, but only 80 pounds of those got assigned on preference, then there's 70 pounds of tomatoes in the inventory that they can trade into. And so if somebody wants to make salsa this week, they can take all the rest of their produce and trade it for tomatoes. And I'm fine with that, because it doesn't matter to me what goes out the door that much, as long as as long as we can sell the produce we're growing. And then it also gives them the opportunity to do things like, we'll have things like oyster mushrooms, right? Well, oyster mushrooms there's very few people who put that as their very favorite vegetable. But it may be that this week you want to make some stroganoff, and so they can get in there and they can buy a bunch of oyster mushrooms. They can either trade for them or they can actually add them as extras that they purchase. And so that system has really made a big difference, I think, both in our customer satisfaction, but also even in the way that we think about CSA shares. Because now our CSA operates a lot more like a farmer's market in that it can take small amounts of things and big amounts of things and still turn all those into purchases, which wasn't necessarily the case in the past with CSA. One of the big challenges with CSA is if you're going to do parsley, are you going to grow enough parsley to make sure everybody gets a bundle of parsley every 2 weeks? And how's that going to work? Because that means that you're growing enough parsley for 150 bundles of parsley, but you're only going to give that out every 2 or 3 weeks, because you're certainly not going to give out a bundle of parsley to everybody every week. That would be ludicrous. But at the same time, if you don't have a system like Harvey, how are you going to give 10 members parsley and make sure it goes to the 10 that actually want parsley this week? So it's an interesting challenge, and Harvey has addressed it, and we really are. It works really well for us. I'll just say up front, it comes with a big cost. I mean, it's not a cheap thing. It costs us about 10% by the time it's done. That's 7% for Harvey and 3% for the card processing. Yeah, and so that's a high cost, but I'm pretty solidly confident that it's worth it. We've done it 2 years now, 3 CSA seasons, including winter, and our customers are really happy. We're really happy, and now I can do something. If I got 5 boxes of habaneros, that's cool. I'll just put it in the Harvey, and if people really want habaneros, they're going to get them, or they can trade for them, or they can purchase them, and that still moves my product without requiring me to grow 100-foot row of habaneros, just so I can provide habaneros to everybody once or twice.
So it basically removes so much of the back end finagling and thought that has to go into a CSA. It basically eliminates a lot of hours that you'd spend planning and trying to figure this all out.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, I mean, one of the unexpected benefits of Harvey has been when we build that harvest estimate, there's a dollar number at the bottom that says this is your target, right? So this is, based on the shares you've sold. And we've always been a value-based CSA. So we've always had dollar amount on a box, and we don't exceed or diminish that by more than $1 one way or the other. And that's always been a really important part of the way we viewed CSA. I know not everybody does that, but to us, that's been a big deal. So Harvey operates that way as well. So at the bottom, there's this thing. It says typically for a Tuesday harvest, that'll be this time of year about $2,800 worth of produce that we need to put in those boxes to fulfill our obligations. And what we can do is we build that harvest estimate. So we're putting in, we've got 60 dozen ears of corn at $6 a dozen. So now we've got $360 worth of corn. And then our next item, and so on. And all that column is adding up to how much produce are we actually offering. And it's really been very enlightening to watch those numbers and go, okay, we were committed to $2,800 worth of produce, but this week we have $5,000 worth of produce that we're offering. And we can watch that number as the season goes along and say, instead of just having this sort of feeling, we can actually measure that and say, well, look, this is our tight spot. this is when we get down to the least. And so for us, that's end of August, beginning of September, which is kind of interesting, right? And so that shapes our planning and says, well, look, in May, we're really growing a little more than we need to, which is fascinating because May has always been the time of year when we have felt like there wasn't enough space in the fields because we got all this stuff going in, right? Well, now that tells us, we could actually shrink that a little bit. And shrink some of those plantings a little bit, cut back a little bit in May, because in May we've got really a surplus in terms of the CSA. And it's not that that's not necessarily moving through farmers market and other venues, but it is a realization that we don't need that to keep our CSA supported, which is one of the reasons we were overplanting, was to make sure we always had stuff for CSA. But what we can do is we can grow our plantings a little more for August, September, and then and as a result of that, that'll allow us to carry a little larger CSA overall, to keep that capacity up. So for example, to be real specific, right now we're finding ourselves to be about $800 to $900 over value. So it's still a nice healthy margin. We're still about 30% over what we need to offer, but we would like to be seeing more like a 40 to 50% margin, because that slack can be picked up by farmers market fairly easily. And,
absolutely.
So it's been interesting to get this, have these new tools to look at, and so some new metrics that we can look at. And then the other thing I'll mention about Harvey is they've taken a lot of the customer service out of my hands, which is great, because I don't know any farmer who got into farming because they enjoy sitting at the desk responding to emails. I don't think that's a thing. So they do that for me, and so they've taken about, I would say, easily 80% of my email traffic off of my plate and handle it through Harvey customer service. I'm still always in the loop. They use a platform that keeps me in the loop about everything that's going on. And so I always have the ability to interject, but they do that, really well. And it's been a really handy tool for me. And then one more thing I'll mention that I think is really interesting about kind of outsourcing this is they work for me. Now, they definitely have a very strong interest in making sure my customers are happy and satisfied, as do I, of course. But they ultimately, at the end of the day, are on my side. And it's interesting the subtle difference that makes in the way that things get resolved. And it's small. It's dollars and cents usually. But left to me, I will almost always make, we'll call it the more generous choice, right? Yeah. I'll say, oh yeah, we'll refund that. It's okay. I wasn't able to pick up my CSA share last week. What could you do about that? Well, the right answer is, bummer. You didn't pick up your CSA share.
Yes.
It was there, man. I packed a box. It was sitting there ready to go. You didn't pick it up. Bummer. But my instinct, as a people pleaser and as a businessman, is to say, oh, it's cool. We'll refund you for that. Or, we'll pack you a second box next week or whatever, which really is not a good answer business-wise.
No.
And Harvey doesn't do that. Harvey says, bummer.
Yeah.
And then I'm left with the freedom. I can always interject and say, oh, hey, I realized Lorraine's mother died last week. We're certainly going to refund her. We want to take care of her.
Yeah.
But so I can be the human and kind of, generous end of that. And so we haven't left that behind, but I've got this, solid customer service department at Harvey saying, we're here for the farmer's best interest. We want to make sure they're in business next year, and we're going to make decisions that are sound business-wise for them. So that's been an interesting aspect too that I really didn't see coming, that has turned out to be really valuable for us.
So Curtis, that's really interesting about the CSA and really interesting to hear about Harvey. I'm really excited that that's working for you. I've known Simon for a number of years, and we use Member Assembler for a number of years, but I've always been interested in how Harvey has been working for farmers, especially now that they put so much effort into making that such a solid platform.
Yeah, I think it's a really great tool. And, it's probably not going to be for everybody, but for us, it just really has made a huge difference in how well our CSA works. And I think long-term, we're going to see a big difference in retention there. Short-term, we haven't really seen that change dramatically, but I think that the retention is a long game. And I think this is the right path.
Absolutely. With that, I'd like to stop here and take a break. In a minute, we'll be back with Curtis Millsap from Millsap Farm. Hey, Michael here. So you've been enjoying my conversation with Curtis. We've been talking all about CSA, and he's mentioned Harvey a couple times. Now, Harvey's a piece of software which helps you build your CSA box, manage your members. It completely takes care of the customer service that you end up dealing with in your CSA. And I reached out to Simon, who's the owner over at Harvey, and said, Simon, talk to me a little bit more about it. And so he shared that it's probably for farms that are at least $25,000 plus in sales. And he said, look, Michael, refer people over to us, send them our way. We'll give people that mention your name, growing farmers, $200 off their initial sign up or setup fee. So go ahead, reach out to Harvey, find out if it's a good fit for you. If you do sign up, mention our name, and they will give you $200 off that initial setup. So you can go to harvey.farm/4farmers, or just go to the show notes. We'll have this listed in the show notes. But again, it's harvey.farm/4farmers to sign up and find out more information. And again, mention our name, Growing Farmers, for $200 off your setup fee. So we are back with Curtis Millsap from Millsap Farm. Now, Curtis, you have a team on your farm, and in the first half, we've talked actually a little bit extensively about how you manage that. How do you divide roles? Is that something where you have people specialize, or do you more treat tasks as a team opportunity?
So there's a little of both. My farm manager, Kimby, has been with me for 6 years now, I believe it is, closing on 7 years. And so we really farm as co-farmers. We consult each other very regularly. But she does specialize in the flowers. So she manages to cut flowers pretty much from start to finish. She has some help with harvest and arranging those flowers, but the planning of and executing of that plan of flowers is mostly her. I will do most of the soil prep. I run the tractor. I do the bed shaping. That sort of work is almost always me, with some assistance. Sometimes she'll help me, especially if we still use a little bit of biodegradable plastic and do mulch beds that way. And so that's a 2-person job, and she'll almost always be the person helping me, or one of my kids. And then, when it comes to cutting flowers, she pretty much runs that show. I very rarely cut flowers. I can't even think of the last time I think I cut some sunflowers this spring. That's the last time I did any cut flowers. That's a daily harvest for her. I manage most of the CSA marketing and that sort of business. She handles the CSA harvest and the distribution of shares. That doesn't mean we don't help each other with those tasks, but it's pretty clear that those are our areas of responsibility. And so yeah, I think, down the line, we've done a decent job between the two of us of saying, this is you, this is me, this is the things that we need to do together, because it's more collaborative. So, for example, something we do together is our planning process in the winter. We sit down and we spend several days going through our planting plan, our marketing plan, looking at all our numbers. She does the data collation, and then we sit down and look at that spreadsheet and say, okay, this is what we sold, this is how much, and this are trends we see occurring when we look from last year and 2 years, 3 years back on the data, and see we're selling, for example, in that this year we discovered that we were selling less kale than we had been. It seems like kale, for us at least, is starting to kind of downward trend, while collards are picking up. So that was one of those decisions that we made together, observations, the decisions we made together, and say, look, it looks like kale's going down a little bit, collards going up a little bit. Let's shrink our kale planting a little bit, increase our collard planting a little bit. So those are the kind of things we would do together. To some degree, daily assignment of tasks happens together as well. I usually start with a rough draft, but then I'll consult her and say, does this look good to you? This makes sense in terms of what we need to get done today. Interesting thing we've learned about each other. So I am the primary decision maker. So I'm the guy who has to live with those decisions pocketbook wise. I mean, I write the paychecks. I make sure the mortgage stays paid and those kinds of things. And so ultimately, I end up being the person who has to say, this is what we're doing, or that's what we're doing. But we are very collaborative in the way we collect and gather information and opinions and so on. So we'll often at that morning meeting work on that together, think about decisions we're going to make. And then broader, of course, my wife is very involved as well. And so she's always at those morning meetings, and that's a big part of the bigger picture of how the farm gets planned and so on. And then we also have my daughters now. I've got 2 15-year-olds, 2 14-year-olds, 2 12-year-olds, 10, an 8, and a 6. So I've got, and that's in case anybody's counting, that's 8 daughters and 1 son that are still in the house. And so they all have opinions. And I have found that it's worthwhile to listen to those opinions. That doesn't mean that they always prevail, but it is important to take their opinion into account. And then as we divide work up, part of that happens with me understanding people's strengths and weaknesses, and part of it happens with just recognizing people's capabilities. And those are sort of different things, right? I mean, on one hand, strengths and weaknesses sort of implies something somebody enjoys doing and maybe has a special skill for. Some of it is just the ability to get something done and know that this person is physically capable of handling that job. So that's kind of the way we look at it. And it's a constantly shifting thing because our helpers are sort of a constantly shifting cast. There certainly is a core of us who stick around, but there are, there is a flux as we have hourly workers that come and go. We have interns and apprentices that come and go. And then my children also, in the summertime, they're very available to help harvest and work in the fields and help me out. And then now that they're back in school, they homeschool, but they're still very much involved in that and a lot less availability to help on the farm. So as those things shift, then we find ourselves taking on and letting go of certain roles and responsibilities. But we have some pretty defined roles between Kemby and I. As we get beyond that, most of those roles are a little less defined and a little more flexible. We'll make sure to get to pizza night, but my wife really runs that, and she runs it from the start to finish. I am really a worker in pizza night, and she is the boss. And then she also takes a large amount of the marketing work for the farm as a whole. So I do a lot of the CSA specific marketing, but she manages Instagram and Facebook and the social media aspect of how we tell our story. She very much is the heart of that. So yeah, that's a big deal.
Very cool. So with that, let's actually move into that pizza night. How did that get started?
So very early on in the farming, we learned about woofing. And so, this is I think it used to be called willing workers on organic farms. I think the name has shifted somewhat. But the idea is these people who want to travel and stay on farms and work. And so we had this woofer who came to us from St. Louis, and he had woofed on a couple other farms. And one of the farms he'd woofed on was in Wisconsin, and it was a pizza farm. And we were just really intrigued by this idea of people coming out to your farm every week to have pizza. We had worked on a ranch out in New Mexico that had a wood-fired Orno and had done a weekly pizza night as part of a camp that was happening out there. But we hadn't really done anything with that since, so we'd moved back to Missouri. And this was early on. I think this was probably 2008 or so that he visited, maybe 2009. And then it took us a couple years to kind of take that seed of an idea and make it actually happen. And I tell you, when it really happened was that we got found our groove size-wise. We'd actually grown the farm from 1 acre up to 7 acres. The year 2012, we shrunk back to 2 acres. And that year, because we had shrunk and kind of right-sized, I would call it, we figured out that we had capacity to do things like envision other stuff. And one of those was pizza night, which was just took enough time to think it through and say, what would this look like? And then the actual time to physically build an oven. So summer of 2012, we built an oven. We started practicing on friends and family. And I've got a brother who's a very skilled farmer, but also at that time was working for a pizza parlor. And he said, a bit of I think he would say a self-professed pizza snob. He said, I think you guys are making the best pizza in Springfield. And they're like, well, that sounds pretty good. So that was encouraging. And as I say, my wife really is the heart of that. She's just this amazing chef and artisan, has this really creative mind. And so she would put together these pizzas that, my father-in-law calls them who'da thunk it pizzas, right? So things like beets and chev and walnuts on a pizza, or spinach and feta and strawberries on a pizza. Things you just wouldn't think to put on a pizza, but turns out everything's good on pizza, especially if you have this really creative mind behind it that sees all the potential. So in 2012, we practiced on friends and family. 2013, we decided we're ready to kind of invite the rest of the public out and see how that goes. And it was kind of fun. The first pizza night we ever did, there were only I think about 25 of us, and I think staff outnumbered the guests. Yeah. And we had hired a musician, and he was like, are you guys sure you want to pay me? This seems like, and so, things started soft and small, but they grew pretty fast, because what we have is it's a pretty neat event. It's got a really unusual vibe. It's a pizza buffet. We do 4 pizzas. We have a cheese pizza and 3 other kinds of pizza, always based on what's seasonal and fresh and being harvested from the farm. And we have it's totally an outdoor venue. We have really cool draped lights that are kind of set the right tone. We have a big front yard that kids can play in. So, people come, they bring their own beverages, they enjoy pizza, they hang out, and they usually stay for a couple hours. So it's a very relaxed evening for them. And meanwhile, the adults can hang out and visit and watch the sun go down, and the kids play in the front lawn. And we've got gaga ball pit and a couple soccer goals and a tether ball and a basketball court. And it's just this big family free-for-all out there. And so that has grown from this little nebulous of, 25 people at the first pizza night to now running about 250 adults and then another 50 to 60 kids every week. And of course, as the size of the event has grown, its economic impact has grown significantly as well. And so now these people are paying $14 a head to come in. So, we're doing a little better than $3,000 a week on pizza sales. So it's both an economic driver, but I think while that really is important, and I don't want to downplay that at all because it's become a big part of how our farm functions financially, it also has become a huge part of our farm community. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but we didn't really I didn't come into farming because of the work. I came into farming because I wanted this lifestyle. My wife and I wanted to be in a community. We wanted to live our family to be close knit and with one another, but we also wanted to include others in that. And so this has become a really key part of how that works for us. And so we really, really like that all these folks come out and enjoy an evening on the farm with us. And they, in that process, you can see them kind of shedding the anxieties and stresses of work and town and all those things, and just enjoying being out in creation, connecting with one another, connecting with creation, and having this really good food experience while in that setting. So what that's done, is bring people together. And then I should, while we're talking about that, the other kind of aspect of that from a whole farm perspective is the marketing aspect. Yep. And that is that people come out and they connect with the farm, and we don't even have to tell our story. They're experiencing our story. People will come to me, and this is one of the most common quotes people will say to me: "I didn't know things like this existed anymore." Now, I don't totally know what that means. I've thought about it a lot, and I'm not sure things like this ever did exist. I mean, when was there ever a vegetable farm in Springfield, Missouri that served pizza on Thursday night, So I don't really think, but I think what it does reflect is this sort of yearning for community and connection. And when they come out and experience that, then the natural thing is, I want more of this. I want to connect with this more. And so that has also driven CSA sales. It's driven a fierce loyalty in our farmers market customers. People want to connect with us partly because of the quality of our food, the quality of both our pizza and then our produce. But they also want to connect with us because they see us as this important part of their community that they want to support. So,
Absolutely. So you and I were both recently, a couple months ago, at the Frozen Ground 3 conference up in Vermont. And that's where we hung out with Elliot Coleman and Paul and Sandy Arnold, and just a great group of fabulous farmers from all around the U.S. and Canada that were focused on deep winter growing. What would you say your big takeaway from that conference was?
So, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was there was a huge diversity of opinion about need for fertility, how much fertility we needed to do these different crops. And some of that can be attributed to soil type. I mean, I know, for example, we had some growers there who are growing on really sandy soil, and they're just dumping amounts of nitrogen on their soil that I can't even imagine on my soil. I would be eaten alive by aphids putting that much nitrogen down. But then, on the other hand, there was a good dialogue about what are we doing around this? What are we using for nitrogen sources and potassium and phosphorus as well? But what are we doing there? And then and so there's some peace of mind that came to me around that to say there's a diversity of opinion around this because there are a diversity of solutions to this. And so that was kind of comforting on one hand. It also was interesting to hear this wide range of things. I think the biggest takeaway probably from the Frozen Ground Conference for me, though, was that everybody can do this. And we know that on one hand. Like it's obvious when you look at, Elliot's been doing up in Maine for a couple of decades now. Obviously, winter growing is a real thing, can work really well. But the interesting thing was we had, people from across the continent doing this stuff, and really our experiences were a lot more in common than they were different. And so that's encouraging to me. We've been winter growing now for, since we got started. We did a winter CSA our first season, mostly for cash flow reasons, because we just needed to keep that cash flow going. But I've talked to people who've said, can I really do it? I'm in the South. It's too, can we really start those winter things and get them to work down here? Will it be too hot? Or it's just too cold and I really don't think I can do that. Well, we had people from the upper end of Michigan, us in southern Missouri. I think there were some eastern seaboard folks who are even further south than us. Well, that kind of answers to me is it can be done anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, you had Brian Bates, who's way up there in Michigan. You had people from Nova Scotia. You had people from the West Coast. And the cool thing, too, is Brian is starting to look at, adding some heat and some lights. So that was also another interesting aspect of some of the research happening there. Not that that's for everybody, especially since I think we got into farming because of a lot of people got into farming because of the low input aspect of it. But, that is research that's really fascinating that he's doing it. And I think there's definitely some takeaways for specific aspects.
Yeah, I think there were several very vigorous debates, we'll call them. How about that, right? Among experienced growers, because that's who's there. Is all of us have been doing this for at least a decade, and some of them a lot longer than that. And so it's always fascinating to me to get groups of people like that together and hear this real, on one hand saying, "Oh yeah, this is the way forward," and other people saying, "Well, no, I don't agree with that," and yet they're coming from very similar backgrounds. The heat thing in particular, I think we've played around with that some as well. In our big greenhouse, we have a wood furnace and we also have a backup propane furnace. And so last year we kept everything above freezing all winter by actually a pretty healthy margin. We tried to keep things up in the 40s last winter. And we did see dramatically better growth. There's no question. And that growth, it's hard to quantify these things. This is one of the challenges of this, and this is really one of the benefits of those type of gatherings, is you can glean from a much wider experience. Because, I apply heat one year, but maybe that year it's also extra sunny. So I can get some weird artifacts there. And that's the challenge, I think, with the light studies as well. It's hard to just nail this stuff down. But if you get enough people together in a room, you can certainly, and enough experience, then you certainly get to the point where you say, okay, this trend is real. This data, although, it may be kind of wide, there's some variations. It is pretty clear to everybody in the room, I think, in that particular instance of heat specifically, that pays its way. Heating a house above freezing, there's no doubt that you get, your head lettuce is a great example, but the returns on head lettuce, the yields on head lettuce are so much better that there's no question it pays to heat a greenhouse for that purpose. Now, does it pay to heat a spinach greenhouse? Well, that's a different question. I don't think anybody is necessarily supporting that, but it's interesting to get that kind of experience together and see that diversity come into kind of some unity there.
Absolutely, yeah. So you also at the conference talked about your Chinese greenhouse. Can you share a little bit more about that? Because that's a super cool greenhouse that you have.
Yeah. So back in, it was at that Great Plains Growers Conference back in probably 2010 or so, maybe 2011. Dr. Sanjun Gu, who at the time was our state horticultural specialist, who is originally from China. So he grew up with working and being around these greenhouses, that are earth-bermed greenhouses over there. And if you want to check it out, there's some great YouTube videos, these greenhouses over in China. But essentially they're three-sided, earth-bermed greenhouses. And of course, the south faces glazed, the north and the east and the west faces are solid, and then backed up by stacked soil. And he was teaching about these at this conference and showing pictures of himself standing by cucumbers being harvested in February. And he said, this is a climate very similar to us. So we're 6B. And he would say, this is a really similar climate to us. Maybe, he said, maybe a little less wind, but there's no reason this can't be done here. And that got my attention. No supplemental heat. I mean, they're not dumping propane or fuel of any sort in there. And the reason this technology has developed there, it's kind of that necessity being the mother of invention. They have very expensive energy, and yet they have low labor costs, historically at least. And so what that led to was this design, which was very energy scrimping, I guess you could say, very conservative of energy, and required a lot of hand labor. And specifically, in this case, the part of their model that required hand labor is they have an insulation curtain they roll down each night. They roll it down in the evening, roll it back up in the morning. And what that does is it just stops the loss. And as anybody who's used a greenhouse knows, getting heat isn't the problem. I mean, every day you've got more than enough heat. I mean, we're trying to dump the heat, right? But then, of course, as soon as the sun goes down, our temperatures drop to within a couple degrees of ambient within an hour or so. And so now you're dealing with, you're not really getting that much benefit from that heat that was there all day in the night. But if you put an insulation curtain over it, that reverses that. Now, we don't have an insulation curtain. And I'll tell you why, and that's because in China, they have a person who lives at the end of each tunnel in a tiny little closet-like house that their job is to roll the window, right? And I have not found anybody who wants to live in a little closet at the end of my greenhouse yet. So currently, we don't have an insulation curtain. But what we do have is the thermal mass. And so that's the other key component of this. So we can't hold all the heat, in the same way that we would maybe be able to do with an insulation curtain. But we can amass a lot of heat in that thermal mass. And so in our case, that's concrete, a wall built out of what they call waste blocks. These are the bunker blocks, you'll hear them called sometimes, but they're a waste product out of the concrete industry where they dump these overages into a mold and then they sell those for pretty cheap. We stacked them up into a 3-sided retaining wall and then bermed earth up against the back of that. And this is a pretty good sized structure. This is 23 by 72, I think it is. And so, it's a decent sized high tunnel. And so in that, we've got about 150,000 pounds of concrete, and then that's backed up by, a lot more pounds than that of soil. So what we've got is we've got this huge thermal mass there that's absorbing heat all day long and then gradually releasing it at night. So specifically what that has meant for us is that in the wintertime, and we get pretty cold, we'll get down to -10 most winters and stay there, for several nights in a row. And it's not uncommon at all for us to hit single digits. We only have had in that tunnel, since we've covered it in 2013, on average, we get 3 or 4 frosty nights a year in there.
Wow.
So that's a pretty big difference. Yeah, I mean, it's a big, and as it gets colder, our temperature differential really spreads. So, when you're right around that 35, 40 degree mark, well, our ambient temperatures won't be a whole lot warmer than that. They may be in the high 40s, low 50s. But when you get down to like 0 or -10, we're still at 35 degrees. That's a big spread. Now we got a 40 degree differential from outside, and that's even without any sort of real. We got double plastic, so we've got that just minimal insulation there, but we're still losing a tremendous amount of radiant heat out of the building. But that thermal mass can do that. There's so much heat stored there that it'll keep that up. So that's been a great place for us to grow. It grows fabulous head lettuce. We've grown celery. We grow a lot of carrots in there in the wintertime. We grew all sorts of herbs, are pretty easy to grow. We actually have some weird spaces that we plug some strawberries and some raspberries. We usually can harvest strawberries and raspberries through most of the winter, mostly just for farm use, but it's kind of fun to do that. We plant cucumbers in there around the 15th of February under row cover. But we don't usually have supplemental heat in there. This year we did put a propane heater in. We had a really cold spring, and so we had a little backup propane heater in there that I ran, I think, 5 nights this spring, just because I wanted to take the edge off, and that helps. But, I probably spent $30 or $40 worth of propane to keep things a little warmer over the spring. To me, that's really not a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And then in the summertime, we find it grows great turmeric and ginger and cucumbers. We have not had much luck with tomatoes or peppers. I think the ventilation is not quite as vigorous as you would get in a bigger tunnel with higher sides and so on. And part of that's just our specific design. We probably didn't adequately consider how much ventilation we were losing by not having 2 side walls that drop down. And so we should have, in hindsight, that's the thing we would change, is we would definitely build more ventilation in. And one of the things they do in China, they actually have a system where they put 2 sheets of plastic on, and so they can part those 2 pieces of plastic and have a mid-roof vent. And that's just kind of a thing you see in the U.S. much, but it's a real standard feature over there. And part of the reason we don't see it is because, again, it's a real hand feature. This is something that, you got a bunch of laborers. It's time to vent the tunnel. Well, with 10 people hanging around working on the structure, that's no big deal. But for us to try, with a much smaller crew per square foot, that's not something we can do easily. So anyway, but those are kind of the big takeaways. It does a great job of those winter vegetables that will thrive in that 40 to 60 degree range that don't necessarily want to freeze. Celery being a good example of that, where celery just, it does fabulous until it gets down to about 38, and then that's just really too cold. But in that mid 40s range, it just chugs along beautifully. So we've had some fabulous celery out of there, and that's a great winter crop for us.
Yeah, and actually in China, these houses can be quite large.
Absolutely, yeah. So ours is, very small by their standards, but we've seen, I've seen diagrams and pictures of them that are, every bit of 50, 60 feet across, 20 meters, and then they'll be hundreds of meters long. There's really no theoretically, there's not really a limit to how long they can be as long as you can keep your ventilation working. And with that system of ventilation they're using, it's somewhat scale neutral, so you can extend it way out. But of course, you get into those. I mean, it's sort of a weird structure. It's a single span structure. And so you get into those distances, and now they're using things like, I think in construction, they would call them webbing I-beams, that sort of business. So they're really hefty structures, but they're also at the same time, relatively simple technologically. You're using this real simple principle of thermal mass to provide most of your heating. That's pretty cool.
And that's free because it's the earth.
That's right. I mean, the sun shines almost every day, and the earth is glad to store that heat. We just have to give it a little bit of encouragement. So,
yeah, absolutely. All right, let's start to wrap this interview up, which has been fabulous, by the way. Let's talk a little bit about new farmers. What's the biggest mistake that you see beginning farmers making?
Well, I think it's complicated to be a new farmer, but I think the biggest mistake is most of them have not enough experience. Certainly was me. I'll speak for myself and say I didn't have enough experience. We jumped in the deep end of the pool, and through the grace of God and many helping hands and lots of good first-year opportunities, things worked out. But it would have been so much easier. We would have wasted so much less money and time and resources had we spent a year farming with somebody else. Because, there's just so many things you have to learn by doing. And you can do that yourself, but there's a high cost. Or you can do that on somebody else's farm. And now when you go, here's a really simple example. I was thinking about this yesterday. My first year, I hauled a bunch of compost from this friend who had a big pile. It was fairgrounds manure that had been piled up for about 10 years, and it was covered with Bermuda. Ooh. And see, you and I know that now. Beginning farmer me didn't know that, right? And that's just basic information that we should all know. Bermuda is the devil. Don't ever let it anywhere near your farm. But I didn't know that, and so I just saw this fuzzy grass growing on top. I knew it was kind of vigorous looking, but I thought, well, we'll get that out when time comes. And so, man, I spread that stuff all over my farm. And so I brought the Bermuda to my farm, to my ever-loving shame. And and had I been on another farm and realized that Bermuda is this bane to vegetable growers, I would have approached the whole thing very differently. Maybe I still would have used that resource, but I would have figured out a way to make sure I killed that Bermuda before I put it anywhere near my fields. And so those kind of things, I think, that's the sort of stuff you can learn on somebody else's dime. I'll be paying for that Bermuda mistake for the rest of my career because the stuff doesn't go away, And so, countless hours and dollars and resources that I've spent now fighting Bermuda, I think that's the biggest thing. People don't get enough experience beforehand. They don't connect enough with other farmers. And the best way to connect with a farmer is to go work with them. Every farmer will take free labor or cheap labor in exchange for knowledge. And I think that is a valid exchange. I think, we have a lot to share. Those of us who've been doing it for a while, we really do have a lot of things. We can save them so much time and effort in the long term.
Yeah, and then that was a significant portion of my learning as well. I mean, obviously, Paul and Sandy were close by. They were my mentors. We worked there a number of days, but I also would travel and call these farmers and say, hey, I just want to come work with you for a day. And visited some very cool farms that way, made some great relationships, and picked up some fabulous tips on exactly how they were really taking their farming to the next level.
Yeah, I think visiting farms is one of the absolute best things you can do, both as a new farmer and as an experienced farmer. I mean, I've never visited a farm, beginner or experienced. I mean, I don't care whether they've been doing it for 6 months or 15 years, 40 years, whatever. Every farm I've ever visited, I've come away with at least one or two ideas that I go, that's a keeper. I'm going to take that home. I'm going to implement it this week or this year. And those, it doesn't take very many of those ideas to make that, day or 2 days or even a week really pay off. Sometimes we can sit there and beat our heads against a wall for a long time. And then we step away from it a little bit, go visit somebody else who's doing what we do or something similar. And the solution is real obvious once we're looking at it from their perspective.
Well, I think it's the fact that as new farmers, so frequently we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, we don't even know the questions to ask. Exactly.
If you could pick one, what would be your favorite farming tool?
My tractor.
Okay.
Oh, man, I love tractor. And it's funny because, we had this conversation about I'm doing less and less tillage. I have a little Ford 1710 four-wheel drive.
Oh, yeah. Fabulous little tractor.
They are just wonderful tractors. My only complaint, it doesn't move quite slow enough for some of what we'd like to do. Primary tillage, for example, it's just hard to get a rototiller to move slow enough behind one of those. I've since used a lot of other tractors, mostly on friends' farms or things that people have loaned to me for a time. And I don't know any tractor that I like as much as that little tractor. It does like 95% of what I need to do on my farm. And the vast majority of that is materials moving and handling. I think that's one thing. I think that's a Joel Salatonism, but I mean, every farmer recognizes it. Most of what we do as farmers is move stuff around. Moving compost out to the field, moving produce back, moving debris from one place to another, moving it back. And you can do that with your back and a wheelbarrow and so on. But boy, a front loader on a tractor. And then I should be specific. Really, my favorite tool is the front loader on my little Ford 1710, because front loaders are I hope whoever invented those is a billionaire somewhere, living a high life, because they deserve it. They are such a wonderful tool. And that's definitely my favorite.
Yeah, and I think with the Ford 1710, though, that is not a quick disconnect for like the bucket. So it's kind of like, it's pretty difficult to take that on and off. But you probably just leave it on.
I do. I've got a set of forks that I've adapted to fit on my bucket. So I kind of cobbled together a quick tack. And this is part of the good thing about being a mechanically minded builder sort of person. We've done all sorts of things like that over the years. But yeah, if I ever change out the tractor, that would be something I would look for. The two things I would look for would be probably hydrostatic, so I can move a little slower. And frankly, so it'll just be a little easier to drive, because I do train a lot of farmers, and I would, a hydrostat's a great tool for a beginning farmer, because you don't have to do too many things at the same time. But also I could, I'd be able to move a little slower. And then the other one would be I'd get a quick attach on the bucket, because I do have, I got all sorts of great ideas of things I would mount to the front of a tractor. But those are all it's harder without a quick attach. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually I think you probably could online, because you can probably buy some parts off eBay. I know we did for ours to actually build our own quick attach system.
Exactly. One of those days.
Yeah, exactly. Just one of those days. All right, Curtis, this has been fabulous. Where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, so check out our website. That's always a good starting point. We do quite a bit on Facebook as well. My wife keeps up Instagram pretty well. If you're local, we do twilight walks every third Wednesday of the month. We host people out on the farm. We had one last night, and it's usually a pretty good crowd. It's mostly growers. Some of them just beginners, some of them very experienced. But we love to share what we do on the farm. It's a good opportunity for people to walk the farm with us, see what's happening currently, and then we have a focus. Like yesterday, we focused on the paper potter and demonstrated that from seed to transplant. So we love sharing what we do on hand. And come visit us. We have an open door. We love to have visitors. Whether it's somebody, if you're a farmer, we don't put limitations on that. If you're just getting started, you want to come learn, we try and keep people here for at least 2 weeks, because otherwise we feel like it's hard to justify our time and their time, really. But if you're a farmer, or even passing through Springfield, we would love for you to stop by. We'd love to share a meal and visit and pick each other's brains.
Absolutely. Curtis, again, thank you so much. Appreciate your time this morning. And I know our audience is going to absolutely love this interview.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the work you're doing.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean every